The title of this panel is Diaspora #1, Integration, and as you can imagine, it will be followed later in the afternoon by Diaspora II, Visibility. We have four excellent papers this afternoon, and I will introduce everybody together and the titles of their presentations, and then they will come up and speak in that order. And my name is Rochelle Davis, and I'm an assistant professor of anthropology in the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies here at Georgetown. So our first paper is by Alexandre Caeiro, and the title is Integration of Diaspora Communities in the Eyes of Orthodox Islamic Scholars. And Alexandre Caeiro is a research fellow at the Erlanger Center for Islam and Law in Europe at the Friedrich-Alexander University in Erlangen, Nuremberg. From 2004 to 2008, he was a PhD fellow at the International Institute for the Study of Islam in the Modern World in Leiden, where he was working on fatwas in Western Europe. He's published a number of articles, including most recently, The Power of European Fatwas, The Minority Fiqh Project, and the Making of an Islamic Counterpublic. And that appeared in the International Journal of Middle East Studies in 2010. And he's currently based in Egypt, where he's conducting research on the transnational spaces of contemporary fiqh discourse. And I imagine he's watching the revolution take place as well. Our second speaker is Petra Kuppinger, and she will be speaking on the El Nur Mosque in Stuttgart, Germany. And she's a professor of anthropology at Monmouth College in Monmouth, Illinois, here in the US. And she works on urban issues in Cairo and topics of space, culture, citizenship, and Islam in Stuttgart, Germany. She's also interested in Muslim popular and consumer cultures, and her recent publications include, quote, Between Anti-Globalization and Islam, Cultural, Political, and Religious Debates in the German Muslim Islamische Zeitung, which was published in Contemporary Islam. She's also written a couple other articles, Factories, Office Suites, Defunct and Marginal Spaces, Mosques in Stuttgart, Germany. Another one called Barbie, Razan, and Fulla, A Global Tale of Culture, Economy, and Religion. And those are the Barbies of various cultures, if you don't follow those things. And another book chapter called Pyramids and Alleys, Global Dynamics and Local Strategies in Giza. And she's also the editor of the journal City and Society. Our third speaker is David Owen, and he's currently a teaching fellow in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard, where he's pursuing a PhD in Islamic intellectual history with a secondary field in classical philosophy. He earned a BA in Hispanic Studies in 2004 and an MA in Arabic Studies in 2006 from Columbia University. In recent years, he's also studied at various academic institutions, including the Arabic Language Institute in Fez, Morocco, the University of Damascus in Syria, the American Institute of Indian Studies in Lucknow, India, and the University of Toronto in Canada, where he received a full fellowship to study Islamic religion and philosophy. And the title of David Owen's paper is Making Muslims in Arab Colombia. And our final speaker on this panel will be familiar to you from this morning, from our keynote address, and that is Louise Kenkar of Marquette University. She's a sociologist in the Department of Social and Cultural Sciences at Marquette University, teaching courses in the social welfare of justice, sociology, and anthropology. Her areas of expertise include Arab American studies, Muslims in the United States, and migration and immigrant integration. In 2004, Dr. Kenkar was a Carnegie Scholar studying the reinvigoration of Islamic practices among second-generation Muslim Americans. She's also published extensively on the Arab American demographics and on their experiences as they intersect with notions of race, the U.S. Census, U.S. foreign policies, and immigrant economic niches. And her award-winning book, quote, Homeland Insecurity, the Arab American and Muslim American Experience After 9/11, came out in 2009. And it draws upon extensive field work and ethnographic interviews while engaging a range of sociological theories and multidisciplinary perspectives. She's conducted research in the US, obviously, as well as Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and Yemen, and has studied the impact of economic sanctions on women and children and forced migration of Palestinians and Jordanians from Kuwait. And I think she'll be speaking on her current research today in a comparative study of second-generation Arab American teenagers living transnational lives in Yemen, Palestine, and Jordan. Louise has been an inspiration to me and many others I know as I went through graduate school in both her sort of life and her work. So it's a real pleasure to have her here today and tomorrow as well. The title of her talk is Managing Identities, Second Generation Arab American Youth. And we have until 3 o'clock, so we'll have each paper will be around 20 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards, and then there'll be a break for coffee, etc., and we'll resume again at 3:15. So thank you and welcome.
So thank you I would like to start by thanking Georgetown University for this opportunity, and I will also start with a little disclaimer. I mean, because of revolutions and other delays, this conference comes right in the middle of the final revisions of my PhD dissertation. So I don't really have a full paper like this morning, most of the presenters have, but I will have a number of notes and ideas that I would like to share with you about the issue of integration of diaspora communities in the eyes of Orthodox Islamic scholars. Right. So there has been in recent years an upsurge of scholarly interest in the social sciences in the continuities and transformations of Islamic law, and how new media in particular have reconfigured the spaces and networks that sustain Islamic legal debates. And my work is part of this renewed interest. And I guess particularly relevant for my purposes here is the work of somebody like John Bowen, who in an article that is probably familiar to many of us, entitled Beyond Migration, Islam as a Transnational Public Space, GEMS, Journal of Ethnic and Minority Studies in 2004, Bowen argues that, and I quote, Islam creates and implies the existence and legitimacy of a global public space of normative reference and debate. And this public space cannot be reduced to a dimension of migration or of transnational religious movements as commonly understood. So Bowen suggests that we focus on Islam as a global transnational public space, which would allow us to take into account the possibility of quite distinct self-understandings of boundaries and legitimacy on the part of both host countries and immigrant populations. And while a public space is a somewhat diffuse and unclear sociological entity in comparison to the actors and organizations that have been the major focus of studies on transnational Islam, it is nonetheless powerful and may enrich our discussions about migration and diaspora in important ways. So Bowen, in the article I referred to, highlights in particular the historical basis of this global public space of reference and debate, based on what he calls Islam's history of movement, communication, and institutional innovation, as well as the idea that it is to the most learned, wherever they may reside, that the Muslim ought to listen. One might also try to historicize this global Islamic sphere of normative fiqh debate by asking what are the conditions of possibility, the shared assumptions, the social intelligibility that allows Islamic public sphere of normative debate to be understood and relevant or made relevant for Muslims living in widely disparate contexts. And this is briefly what I would like to try here in relation to the idea of fiqh al-aqaliyat. Fiqh al-aqaliyat, or minority fiqh, as I will be referring to it, relates to the understandings of the rights and duties under Islamic law of Muslims living as minorities in non-Muslim societies. So Muslims have, of course, lived as minorities throughout history, but the minority condition itself, I think, was not considered worthy of systematic reflection on the part of pre-modern Muslim tourists. Fiqh al-aqaliyat really only emerges as a distinctive field of research in the wake of the post-Second World War establishment of sizable Muslim populations in Western Europe and North America. So I guess what I'm saying is that we should distinguish between descriptive and normative understandings of fiqh al-aqaliyat. So historically, one might contend that instances of fiqh al-aqaliyat have occurred whenever Muslim minorities have sought guidance under the Sharia. The problems they have faced and the juristic opinions that these problems have elicited constitute fiqh al-aqaliyat in this descriptive sense. My paper here is concerned with the normative usages of fiqh al-aqaliyat, which refer to the calls voiced by a range of Muslim actors for devising a new system of Islamic normativity or fiqh that suits the specificities of Muslim minorities. And these calls, I will argue, are a thoroughly modern phenomenon which engage a number of contemporary Muslim scholars and intellectuals, and it's not really restricted to the ulama. So the very expression fiqh al-aqaliyat, if you're not familiar with it, has been subject of intense discussion in Orthodox Muslim, and I should add Sunni circles, with some arguing outright that it is an illegitimate construct that seeks to divide Islam, etc. So this debate on whether minority fiqh is a legitimate project takes place in print, publications, periodicals, newspaper articles, via satellite television, thinking of, there's many fatwa shows now. Yusuf al-Qaradawi's Sharia wal Hayat is probably one of the best known, Islamic Law and Life, but there are obviously many others. In internet forums, in international fiqh councils, etc. And the scholars who are actively promoting this idea and calling for the establishment of a minority fiqh make up a quite heterogeneous group. They are based in France, Britain, and the United States, as well as in Egypt, Morocco, Saudi Arabia. Like their critics, advocates of fiqh al-aqaliyat operate in this global space of normative fiqh debate that Bowen speaks about. Unlike their critical interlocutors, perhaps, they also have to work through the disjuncture that arises out of their various geographical locations, in other words, their operation in a global field, on the one hand, and their own commitment to setting symbolic boundaries, designing a fiqh for minorities but not for majorities, on the other. So there are various ways in which one can try to understand what is fiqh al-aqaliyat discourse. In my dissertation, I basically look at a number of texts that argue in favor or against the idea, and then a corpus of fatwas issued by some institutions, including most prominently in my case, the European Council for Fatwa and Research. I'm not sure I will have time to deal with all of this here. I think perhaps a little bit of the context first. The idea of fiqh al-aqaliyat is quite recent, and in some ways maybe already giving way to other constructs. So the first attempts to theorize a Muslim fiqh for minorities, as far as I am aware, appeared actually in the 1990s. And they were the result of master and doctoral theses submitted to the Sharia faculties of universities in the Muslim world, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon. And the authors were either students from Europe or local Arab scholars who had a particular interest in the region. These scholars drew on the research on Muslim minorities that had been undertaken in Arab universities since the late 1970s, notably through the work of the Institute for Muslim Minority Affairs that was set up at the King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, as well as on a steady flow of accounts published by Muslim scholars who had studied or worked in the West, especially since World War II. This kind of interest in the questions of Muslims in the West increased significantly in the post-Cold War period, when Islam in the West became related and opposed with a new intensity, and then again after 9/11. So fiqh al-aqaliyat in many ways illustrates how geopolitics penetrates into religious discourse and impacts on the politics of knowledge production. Debates on fiqh al-aqaliyat are framed, of course, by the Islamic legal tradition and its associated concepts, Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Kufr, and intermediate categories, loyalty, al-wala, and enmity, al-bara, etc. But they are also framed significantly by the question of non-Muslim minorities in Islamic countries, which is almost always the starting point, if you read the texts of these of the scholars, for thinking about Muslim minorities in non-Muslim states, as well as problematic international relations between Muslim and non-Muslim states in the post-bipolar world. The question of the contemporary relevance of the Islamic legal tradition, which most authors seek to assert, And they also connect very directly with questions of Muslim identity in the West, and most importantly, perhaps, with discourses on integration of Islam in Europe. So, I mean, I've been struck by how Muslim scholars, even in international fiqh assemblies in the Muslim world, keep sliding from a discussion on Muslim minorities in general to a much more focused discussion about Muslims in Europe. And this may be in part due to the prominence of the European Council for Fatwa and Research in these discussions, which is a body I've already alluded to, but I have not given any proper understanding. Body set up in 1997, headed by Yusuf al-Qaradawi and composed of some 30 scholars based in Europe, but also in the Muslim world, many of which sit in these international fiqh councils. So this may partly explain why fiqh al-aqaliyat debate is about Europe to some extent, I would submit. But more significantly, I think this Europe-centered nature of the debate suggests a certain indebtedness of fiqh al-aqaliyat to European understandings of the place of Muslim minorities, and in particular by what we could call the rationality of integration discourses. What is the rationality of integration discourses? I think integration in Europe, and I guess, I don't know how familiar this audience might be, has become really an imaginary that involves a kind of redescription of society framed by a political horizon that is by no means self-evident. So immigrants become seen as Muslims, and a whole range of social problems become redescribed in terms of lack or insufficient integration. And this discourse is, of course, connected to a whole range of different logics and rationalities, including, perhaps most prominently, the anti-terrorism discourse that links political violence to questions of integration in ways that might be somewhat surprising if you look at the empirical nature of terrorist attacks in Europe. So I would like to suggest here that minority fiqh advocates assume that Muslims must adapt to European societies. So they thus share with many of European policymakers and public intellectuals a common diagnosis of the current situation, the failure of integration, which is like the criteria by which this failure is evaluated is never actually made clear. An understanding of Muslims as morally responsible for this failure, so due to the extremist or fundamentalist interpretations of Islam, and the vision of the conditions under which community cohesion becomes possible and social conflict is eliminated. So for the muftis here, the idea of Islam as a kind of civil religion contributing to the common good. And it is the interiorization of the rationality of integration discourses, I would suggest, that sets in motion the fiqh al-aqaliyat debate and explains why Europe features so prominently in these discussions. So the very terms that Orthodox Muslim scholars engaged in this debate use are directly borrowed from European debates. So I mean, in Europe, you always, or increasingly oppose integration to like two poles, the pole of segregation or communautarism in France, and on the one hand, and assimilation on the other. And these are precisely the very terms that these Muslim scholars, who some of them don't even speak European languages, but are translating. So they are constructing Islamic theories of integration in Dimaj, which they oppose to dhawaban, dissolution or assimilation, as well as uzla, segregation. So there's, I think, a fruitful field there of study to see how these connections are made possible. How much time do I have? Like 5 minutes. So, and I think in this minority fiqh discourse that I'm trying to describe takes the form of a public whereby Muslims in Europe are interpolated less as members of a bounded community, but rather as members of a kind of distinctive public, a public of European Muslims despite, or rather because of their internal differentiation in terms of language, ethnicity, class, political orientation, and level of religious commitments. So I'm drawing here partly on the article that was referred to in Ishmes, where I've tried to think with Michael Warner, about what a public is. For Michael Warner, a public is an imagined relationship amongst strangers, characterized by the reflexive circulation of discourse. It requires mere attention, and its rhetorical imagination is a performative act. So it creates a public merely by virtue of addressing it as such. So this minority fiqh public, if we want to describe it more precisely, would be a space of discourse that seeks to articulate two kinds of commitment, a commitment to the Islamic revival, let's say, with its emphasis on commitment to the Islamic normativity, as well as a commitment to the kind of rationales or rationalities of and problematics of European integration. I mean, I've tried to understand this public as instituting a kind of a Muslim reader, insofar as it appears to be very much text-based. I will not go into that here. I think if we want to, I would just like to conclude by suggesting some ways in which we might want to think about the success or lack of success of this kind of enterprise, insofar as a public is always in excess of its social basis. How do we actually decide or measure? Two brief comments here, which is, since the aim of fiqh al-aqliyat is to provide an authoritative reading of the Islamic tradition in a context of migration and social change, its success will depend upon the recognition of Muslim audiences. And this recognition, we could try and think about how do we actually think about recognition of Muslim audiences which are very heterogeneous in relation to kind of Orthodox discourse that Muslim scholars disseminate. I think there's ways in which we might suggest that this discourse is made relevant in relation to intergenerational transformations of European Islam. So sociologists who work on Islam in Europe have often talked about how the parents had practiced a lived Islam, and the children and subsequent generations went about constructing their Islam. So this kind of seems to favor a kind of turn towards scriptural forms that broadly echo the fiqh al-aqliyat discourse. There'll be much more to say about that. I want to conclude by suggesting that this minority fiqh project must also be related to the way the project resonates or not with wider public debates about the integration of Islam in Europe. And these debates are complex, and I've oversimplified some of the rationalities of integration discourse here, but in any case, they are debates that cannot be merely discussed in terms of like liberalism or secularism. The kinds of shifting emphasis of integration discourse in Europe today suggest much more blurred and messy categories. Okay, so I think I'll stop here, and then thank you very much.